I have replayed the events of that season more times than I can count. Not because remembering them gives me comfort, but because in the silence of night, when all the world is asleep, the mind insists on rewinding. It pulls you back into the exact words, the exact glances, the precise moment when you realize something inside your family has cracked beyond repair. I tell this story not because I want sympathy, not because I want to convince anyone of my worth, but because the truth, once buried, has a way of clawing its way to the surface. My daughter's name is Amber. For years, even speaking it felt like tasting honey, sweet and golden. I can still hear the lilt of her childhood voice calling Mama. Still see the way her little fingers used to clutch mine as if letting go would mean the world itself might vanish. She was my everything, my reason for enduring, the pulse behind every sacrifice I ever made. But that little girl vanished slowly year by year, replaced by a woman who one day, dressed in ivory silk and diamonds, looked into my eyes and told me without hesitation, "You're the worst mother anyone could have. The best gift you can give me is to disappear." It's impossible to explain what those words did to me without taking you back. Back to the beginning, when the engagement was announced and I, ever the hopeful mother, convinced myself joy was all I felt. I smiled at her plans, listened to her chatter about flowers and venues, nodded at each decision as though every one of them mattered equally to me. I wanted to be the kind of mother who supported unconditionally, who celebrated unreservedly. And yet, underneath, something uneasy stirred. A tremor beneath the surface. Amber's smile seemed rehearsed, her laughter sharpened into performance. Gratitude, when it came, was brittle. I told myself not to notice. That she was stressed, that every bride turned demanding when faced with the chaos of planning a wedding. I reminded myself of my own youth, how convinced I had been that my world revolved solely around my desires. But then came the little cruelties, the subtle dismissals. One afternoon, she came by the house where she'd grown up. I had polished and dusted, arranged fresh flowers in the vase by the window. She walked from room to room, her eyes skimming the details with disinterest, fingers brushing over the curtains I had sewn with my own hands. "It's a bit dated, isn't it?" she remarked, as though commenting on a stranger's decor. My chest tightened, but I laughed lightly as though it didn't sting. Blake, her fiancé, tried to soften the moment with a gentle touch to her arm, but Amber only frowned. I told myself again it was stress. Just stress. Mothers make excuses. We need to believe in the goodness of our children, even when their words cut like glass. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, I should have known what awaited me. And still I prepared. I cooked dishes steeped in memory, polished the silverware until it gleamed, arranged the table with the care of someone who still believed love could be communicated through effort. When Amber and her bridesmaids swept in, I waited for her to notice, to offer even a brief word of appreciation. Instead, she glanced once at the table and said, "I hope the caterer tomorrow does better." My stomach dropped, but I smiled because what else could I do? The dinner unfolded in fragments, conversations fractured, laughter tinged with unease. Blake's parents were kind, gracious, but I caught his mother watching me once or twice with something I didn't want to name: pity. When Amber stood for a toast, my heart swelled with anticipation. This would be the moment, surely, when she would acknowledge all that had been done for her. But her words sliced instead of soothed. "Well, this has been quaint," she said with a laugh. "Not exactly what I envisioned, but compromise is part of marriage, isn't it?" She went on, little jokes at my expense, each one landing like a pinprick in the silence of the room. Guests glanced at me, waiting for my reaction. I raised my glass, my smile frozen, and swallowed it down like poison. Later that night, when the house had emptied and the quiet pressed in, I sat in the dark, clutching my chest. I remembered every costume I had sewn for her as a child, every night I had stayed up helping her finish schoolwork, every sacrifice I had made so she could feel secure. I thought of the years I had held her world together, often at the expense of my own, and I realized with a heaviness that nearly broke me, none of it mattered to her. The morning of the wedding was painted in golden light, as though the world itself wanted to mock me with beauty. I woke imagining joy, convincing myself there could still be tenderness between us. At the venue, I found her surrounded by bridesmaids, commanding them with sharp instructions. I approached gently, offering to help. She didn't even look at me. "We've got it, Mother. Just try not to stress everyone out." Her words landed with the finality of a slammed door. I stood there, useless in the corner, watching her twirl before the mirror. She was breathtaking, undeniably. But beauty without softness is brittle. I searched her face, desperate to catch a glimpse of the little girl who once curled against me with her bedtime stories. I couldn't find her. She was gone. The ceremony unfolded flawlessly. Guests whispered about the perfection, the flowers, the music, the vows. They saw a picture of happiness. I stood smiling in the photographs, smiling as people congratulated me, smiling until my face ached. Only I knew the hollow echo beneath the glitter. Only I carried the weight of what was unraveling. It was later, during the reception, when the fracture turned irreparable. I sought her out, desperate for one moment, one small memory of connection to hold on to. She stood near the back of the hall, champagne in hand, posture proud and cold. I touched her arm, my voice soft. "Amber, I just wanted to tell you how beautiful you look today. And how proud." She laughed, sharp as broken glass. "Proud? Of what? That I managed all this despite you? Don't pretend, mother. You've been more of a burden than a blessing my entire life." I froze. She stepped closer, her eyes hard. "You've smothered me, embarrassed me, dragged me down with your constant need to be involved. Do you even see yourself? Do you realize how exhausting you are? You're the worst mother anyone could have. And I'm done. Do you understand me? Done." The room around us blurred. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. All of it receded into silence. All I could hear were her words, searing themselves into me like fire. I tried to speak, to form some answer, but nothing came. I only remember the finality in her tone, the coldness in her eyes as she turned away, leaving me standing there as though I were already gone. Betrayal doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps in, a slow erosion of trust. 1,000 small cuts you convince yourself to ignore until suddenly you realize you are bleeding out. That day, Amber's words were the culmination of years of dismissals, of small cruelties, of sacrifices left unacknowledged. They were the echo of the truth I had never wanted to face, that in her eyes I was not her safe place, not her mother, but a weight she longed to cast aside. And yet, as I drove home that night, my tears blinding me, I felt something I had not expected. Clarity. For the first time in decades, I saw myself not through her eyes but my own. I had given everything I could. I had loved with all the strength inside me. And if that gift was met with rejection, perhaps the failure was not mine alone. That was the beginning. The moment the bond between us fractured beyond recognition. The moment I stopped being simply Amber's mother and began, painfully, to rediscover what it meant to be myself. The night after the wedding felt like the longest of my life. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the dress I had chosen so carefully, the pearls at my neck pressing uncomfortably against my skin. I couldn't bring myself to undress. It was as though peeling away the fabric would mean accepting that the day was over, that everything I had dreamed for my daughter had ended, not in celebration but in rejection. My reflection in the mirror looked foreign to me, my eyes swollen, my mouth drawn tight. I whispered her words again, as though repeating them would somehow dull their sting. "The best gift you can give me is to disappear." The syllables echoed in the quiet room until they became unbearable. I had raised Amber on my own after her father left. I wore the armor of strength for years, convincing myself that if I sacrificed enough, she would see me as her foundation, her protector. I wanted her to never feel abandoned the way I had. And yet, sitting there that night, it struck me that perhaps I had done too much. Perhaps my presence had become suffocating in her eyes, a reminder of the fragility of our past instead of the security I intended. The thought tore at me, but I couldn't deny it. The days that followed were a blur. Friends called to ask about the wedding. "It must have been beautiful," they said, their voices warm, expectant. I gave polite answers, never mentioning the shadows that had crept into the corners of the day. How could I? To admit the truth would be to confess that my daughter, the child I had nurtured, wanted nothing more than my absence. So elite. I spoke of the flowers, the music, the way Amber glowed in her gown. And when I hung up the phone, I sat in silence, the weight of my own exclusion pressing heavier each time. Amber and Blake moved into their new home within weeks. I wanted to visit, to bring them a gift, something to mark the beginning of their marriage. I baked bread the way I used to when Amber was small, the scent of it filling the kitchen with comfort. I wrapped it carefully, drove across town, and stood at their doorstep with hope trembling in my chest. Amber opened the door, her expression flickering from surprise to irritation. "Mother," she said flatly, blocking the entry with her body. "I just wanted to bring you something," I murmured, holding out the package. "A little housewarming." She didn't take it. She glanced over her shoulder, perhaps checking if Blake was nearby, and then sighed. "We're really busy, Mother. Maybe another time." I stood there, my arms aching from holding the gift, my smile faltering. Finally, Blake appeared behind her, his face lighting with the warmth hers lacked. "Oh, is that bread?" he asked, stepping forward. "That smells amazing. Thank you." He took the package from my hands before Amber could stop him, and for a moment gratitude softened his eyes. Amber, however, closed the door with a firm finality, leaving me on the porch with the taste of rejection in my mouth. It became a pattern. I would reach out. Calls unanswered, messages ignored, visits met with strained courtesy. Amber's distance grew colder, sharper, until it was no longer distance but a wall. At gatherings where others were present, she played the role of dutiful daughter, smiling for appearances, but her words to me were clipped, her tone impatient. When we were alone, she barely spoke at all. I tried to rationalize it. Marriage changes people, I told myself. She's finding her independence, learning how to be a wife. But deep down, I knew it wasn't marriage that had built this divide. It was something deeper, something festering for years that had finally found its voice at the wedding. Blake, for his part, remained kind. He called me once quietly to thank me for the bread, for the effort I had made. "I know things are complicated," he said hesitantly, "but I want you to know I appreciate you." His words were like drops of water in a desert. I clung to them, though I dared not tell Amber. I suspected she would see his kindness as betrayal. The loneliness settled into my bones. The house that once rang with Amber's laughter now felt cavernous, echoing with memories I wished I could silence. I busied myself with small routines, gardening, knitting, volunteering at the library. Strangers appreciated my efforts more than my own child did. Some evenings when I returned home after hours of distraction, the silence wrapped around me so tightly I could hardly breathe. One night, unable to sleep, I dug out old photo albums. There was Amber in her kindergarten dress, her smile wide and pure. There she was at her 12th birthday, beaming as she held the cake I had stayed up half the night decorating. At her graduation, standing tall with her diploma, the pride in her eyes unmistakable. I traced the images with trembling fingers, asking myself where I had lost her. Was it gradual, hidden in the folds of time? Or was there one moment, one decision I made that pushed her away for good? The community noticed, though they didn't say it outright. At church, people asked after Amber, their eyes searching mine for signs of joy. "She must be so happy now," they said. I nodded, smiled, deflected. But I could see the flicker of doubt in their expressions, the unspoken question. Why wasn't I included in that happiness? Gossip moves quickly in small towns. I caught whispers. She didn't invite her mother to the shower. I heard she doesn't visit much. Each word felt like a needle stitching shame into my skin. Still, I kept trying. I sent Amber a letter once, pouring my heart onto the page. I wrote of my love, of my wish to understand, of my hope that we could find each other again. I slipped it into her mailbox myself, my hands shaking. Weeks passed with no reply. When I finally asked her about it, she looked at me with cold detachment. "I read it," she said simply. "I don't have anything else to say." Her rejection was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, intentional. And yet, paradoxically, it gave me clarity. For years, I had measured my worth by her approval. I had contorted myself to fit her needs, silenced my own desires to ensure her comfort. But now, faced with her open disdain, I began to ask myself, who am I without her validation? Who is the woman who exists outside the role of Amber's mother? It was a terrifying question, but also, in a strange way, liberating. I began to spend more time with people who valued me. A neighbor named Margaret invited me for tea, and I found myself laughing in her kitchen, the sound foreign but welcome. At the library, children clung to my stories during reading hour, their eyes bright with wonder. They didn't see a burden, an embarrassment. They saw warmth. They saw kindness. Slowly, I started to reclaim pieces of myself I had forgotten. I picked up painting again, brushes moving clumsily at first, then with growing confidence. The colors bled across the canvas, chaotic but honest. In those strokes I poured the grief, the anger, the fragile hope that still flickered inside me. But healing isn't linear. There were nights I still sat awake, Amber's words replaying like a cruel refrain. "You're the worst mother anyone could have." I would press my palms against my ears as if I could block the memory, but it lived inside me, echoing from within. Some wounds don't close cleanly. They throb, they scar. They remind you of what you've lost even as you move forward. One afternoon, months after the wedding, Blake came to visit. He arrived alone, his posture tense, his eyes tired. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Amber once did her homework, where countless meals had been shared. He looked around as though the room itself carried memories. "I just wanted to check on you," he said quietly. I studied him, wondering if Amber knew he was here. "I'm surviving," I replied honestly. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She can be difficult. I don't know if she'll ever admit it, but I think some of this isn't about you. It's about her. She carries things, expectations, resentments. Please don't think it's all your fault." His words were a balm, though they also deepened the ache. I wanted to ask him more, to understand what Amber said about me when I wasn't there. But I held back. It wasn't fair to put him in that position. He left soon after, but his kindness lingered, a reminder that not everyone saw me through Amber's lens. The shift inside me was slow but real. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by Amber's approval. A future where I could stand on my own, where my worth wasn't tethered to her acceptance. The thought scared me. It also thrilled me. And yet, even as I took tentative steps forward, I knew the wound of her rejection would always remain. Love doesn't vanish simply because it's unreturned. A mother's heart doesn't stop beating for her child, no matter how sharp the knife they drive into it. But perhaps, I thought, perhaps survival means learning to carry that wound without letting it define you. Perhaps survival means finding strength not in being someone's everything, but in being enough for yourself. That was the lesson I had just begun to learn, in the shadow of my daughter's cruelty, in the quiet of a house that was finally, painfully, my own. The days after Amber's wedding felt like a blur, a strange mixture of numbness and sharp, cutting pain. I moved through my routines almost mechanically, as though my body knew what to do even when my spirit wanted to collapse. The echoes of her words, "The best wedding gift is you disappearing from my family," seemed to follow me everywhere. I heard them in the silence of my empty kitchen, in the rustle of leaves outside my window, even in the creak of the stairs when I walked alone through the house. My daughter had exiled me, and she had done it so publicly, so deliberately, that there was no mistaking her intention. She didn't just want space. She wanted erasure. Neighbors stopped by with polite smiles, carrying leftover desserts from the wedding reception or offering small talk that only deepened the ache in my chest. Some avoided the topic entirely, pretending they hadn't witnessed the coldness in Amber's eyes when she looked at me. Others, unable to contain their curiosity, circled the subject with carefully worded questions. "How was the big day?" Or "You must be so proud of her." Their voices carried an undercurrent of gossip, of whispers traded across fences and in grocery store aisles. I could feel their eyes studying me, waiting to see if I would break, waiting to see how a mother survives being rejected by her only child. Behind closed doors, the silence was suffocating. The house that once echoed with laughter, arguments, and the clatter of Amber's footsteps was now only mine, and it felt cavernous. I tried to busy myself with chores, dusting shelves, rearranging drawers, even scrubbing the baseboards, but no amount of cleaning could scrub away the emptiness. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of Amber as a little girl. The way she used to curl up in my lap with her favorite blanket. The way she once clung to me on her first day of school, tears streaming down her cheeks. How could that child have become the woman who looked me in the eye and told me I was the worst mother she could imagine? Blake, her husband, was the only thread that remained between us. He called once after the wedding, his voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "I just wanted to check on you," he said softly, as though speaking too loudly might draw Amber's wrath even across the phone line. I know things were tense. Tense. The word seemed almost laughable, a flimsy veil over the brutality of what had happened. But I appreciated his attempt, his gentleness. For a brief moment I heard kindness in his tone, A trace of guilt perhaps, as if he understood the cruelty of Amber's dismissal. Yet even his calls dwindled, replaced by silence as Amber's influence closed in around him. The community's whispers grew louder. At the market, I overheard a woman murmur, "Imagine your own daughter cutting you out like that." Another responded, "Well, we don't know what goes on behind closed doors." Their words stung, not only for the judgment implied but for the suggestion that perhaps I deserved this exile. Had I failed Amber? Had I been too strict, too lenient, too protective, too distant? Every possibility spun in my mind like a carousel I couldn't escape. My family, what little of it remained, was divided. My sister Helen tried to comfort me, reminding me that children sometimes lash out when they're overwhelmed. That time might soften Amber's heart. But others weren't so forgiving. An aunt bluntly told me, "You must have done something. Daughters don't just turn on their mothers like that for no reason." I wanted to scream, to explain, to pour out all the years of sacrifice. The nights I stayed awake worrying about Amber's future. The dreams I set aside so she could pursue hers. But I held my tongue, because I realized no one outside of this fractured bond could truly understand the devastation of being rejected by your own child. And yet, amid the pain, something began to shift within me. Perhaps it was the quiet, perhaps it was sheer survival instinct, but I started noticing moments of unexpected strength. One afternoon, while walking past the mirror in the hallway, I paused. For years, I had seen only exhaustion in my reflection, the lines etched by sleepless nights, the weariness of carrying burdens too heavy for one pair of shoulders. But that day I saw something else. I saw resilience. My back was straighter, my eyes clearer. I realized that, for the first time in decades, I was no longer bending myself to fit Amber's demands or expectations. The rejection that had nearly broken me was, in a strange way, forcing me to stand on my own. Still, Amber's cruelty deepened. Word spread that she had begun telling people stories about me, half-truths twisted into weapons. She claimed I had manipulated her finances, that I had tried to control every detail of her wedding, that I was jealous of her happiness. Each lie cut deeper than the last, not only because they distorted the truth, but because they revealed just how far she was willing to go to erase me from her new life. Friends who once visited me stopped coming. Invitations that had always included me now arrived addressed only to Amber and Blake. The circle of exclusion tightened until I felt completely outside the world I had once inhabited. Blake, caught in the middle, grew quieter whenever we crossed paths. At church one Sunday, I saw him standing alone while Amber chatted animatedly with a group of women. He looked at me, his eyes flickering with something unspoken, regret maybe or sympathy, but he quickly looked away when Amber rejoined him. It was as if he lived in two realities, one where he recognized my worth, and another where he was bound to Amber's narrative. His silence was a kind of betrayal, though I couldn't entirely blame him. Loving Amber meant choosing her side. Even when it meant turning away from the truth, I began keeping a journal, pouring out thoughts I couldn't say aloud. Page after page filled with memories, regrets, questions, and tentative hopes. Writing became my lifeline, a way to release the anguish that threatened to suffocate me. And in those pages, I began to uncover patterns, moments when Amber's cruelty had shown itself long before the wedding. Times I had excused her manipulation as stress, or her sharp words as youthful defiance. I began to see a thread running through her actions, a pattern I had been too blinded by love to confront. The realization was painful, but it also brought clarity. I could no longer deny that Amber's rejection, as brutal as it was, had not been born overnight. It was the culmination of years of small dismissals, quiet lies, and subtle cruelties I had chosen to overlook. In protecting her, in excusing her, I had allowed those traits to grow unchecked. And now they had blossomed into the cruel declaration that I was no longer part of her family. The more I reflected, the more I felt a strange mix of sorrow and liberation. Sorrow for the bond we had lost, for the daughter who had chosen deception over love. But liberation, too, in recognizing that I was not powerless. For so long, I had believed that Amber's approval defined me, that her happiness was the measure of my worth as a mother. But now, stripped of her approval, I began to ask myself, who was I apart from her? The answer came slowly in small moments. The first time I accepted an invitation from a neighbor for coffee, despite fearing the whispers. The first time I laughed, truly laughed. At a silly television show. realizing I hadn't lost the capacity for joy. The first time I sat on the porch at sunset and felt peace, however fleeting. These moments stitched themselves together into a fragile but growing sense of self. Still, the tension with Amber hovered like a storm cloud. Each family gathering, each holiday, carried the threat of confrontation. Rumors reached me that Amber had begun questioning Blake's loyalty, accusing him of being too soft, too sympathetic toward me. Their marriage, though outwardly perfect, showed cracks when Blake occasionally let slip a comment that contradicted Amber's version of events. I wondered if he saw through her lies, if he recognized the manipulation. Or perhaps he too had learned the cost of challenging her. One evening, I received a message from an old friend who had attended the wedding. "I don't know what happened between you and Amber," she wrote gently, "but I want you to know I saw the way she spoke to you. It wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." I stared at the message for a long time, tears blurring the screen. For the first time, someone had acknowledged my pain without suspicion or judgment. It was a small flicker of validation, but it meant everything. And so, part 3 of my journey was not one of resolution but of awakening. I was still in the wilderness of rejection, still aching for the daughter I had lost, still wrestling with guilt and anger. But beneath the grief, a foundation was forming. I was beginning to see myself not as a victim of Amber's cruelty, but as a woman reclaiming her voice, her dignity, her worth. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and heartbreak yet to come. But I was no longer walking bent beneath the weight of her rejection. Slowly, painfully, I was learning to stand tall. The weeks after Amber's wedding turned into months, and though I tried to convince myself that time might soften her anger, the opposite seemed to happen. Her distance hardened into something more deliberate, like a wall she was determined never to let me climb. At first, I still held on to small hopes, that a holiday might bring her back, that a birthday would force her to reach out, that Blake might gently encourage her toward reconciliation. But as each occasion passed in silence, I began to understand that she had no intention of looking back. What I didn't realize then was how much energy I had spent over the years managing her moods, smoothing over her outbursts, filling the cracks in her stories so no one else would notice. Now that I wasn't doing those things, those cracks began to show. Small lies she had told to friends and neighbors started to unravel. People noticed the inconsistencies in her stories, the way she shifted blame whenever something went wrong. Some whispered about how quickly she had changed after marrying Blake, how sharp her words had become, how she seemed to carry herself with a coldness that didn't match the smiling facade she presented in public. One evening, I ran into Mrs. Taylor, an older neighbor who had known Amber since childhood. She stopped me on the sidewalk, her expression hesitant but curious. "I saw Amber at the market last week," she said, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. "She told me you'd moved away, that you couldn't bear living here anymore." She searched my face, puzzled. "But here you are." I managed a tight smile, though my heart sank. "I'm still here," I said quietly. Mrs. Taylor frowned. I thought it sounded strange. "You've always loved this town." She shook her head, muttering, "That girl." Before letting the sentence drift away, it wasn't just Mrs. Taylor. Similar stories reached me from others. Amber telling people I was unstable, that I had caused chaos during her wedding, that she had been forced to cut ties for her own well-being. The lies hurt, but more than that, they revealed something undeniable. Amber was trying to rewrite history, to erase me not just from her life but from the narrative of her past. Blake's silence became heavier during this time. I would sometimes see him in town, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting away when he spotted me. Yet once at the post office he approached me when Amber wasn't there. His voice was low, careful, as though each word had to slip past a gatekeeper. "I just want you to know," he said, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest moment. "I don't believe everything she says." It was a small sentence, but it carried the weight of a confession. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. And then he was gone, retreating into the safety of Amber's shadow. Night, I thought about him often, not in longing but in sorrow. He had married a woman who spun illusions, who cut people off when they threatened her image. He must have seen glimpses of the truth by now. And yet, he had chosen to stay, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of fear. Maybe both. My journal became thicker with each passing week. I wrote about Amber's childhood, about the small lies I had ignored, The missing allowance money she always swore she hadn't taken, the way she manipulated friends to get her way, the sudden tears that appeared whenever she wanted sympathy. I had told myself she would outgrow these habits, that adolescence was a storm every parent had to weather. But now I wondered if those storms had been early signs of something deeper, traits that were less about growing pains and more about character. Still, even with this painful clarity, I wrestled with guilt. Mothers are supposed to shape their children, aren't they? To teach them right from wrong? If Amber had grown into someone who could look her own mother in the eye and speak words meant to wound, then hadn't I failed her? Nights were the worst, when shadows filled the corners of my room and doubt crept in. I would replay old conversations in my mind, searching for moments I should have handled differently. The time she lied about failing an exam and I covered for her. The time she took money from my purse and I let it go because I didn't want her to feel shamed. Had those small acts of mercy been seeds that grew into entitlement? But alongside the guilt, a different thought began to grow. Perhaps Amber's choices were not entirely my responsibility. Perhaps part of who she was came from somewhere else, from someone else, traits she had inherited, patterns she had absorbed long before she understood them. It was a thought that frightened me, because it meant there were pieces of her I could never have shaped or changed. No matter how hard I tried. As autumn came, the community's whispers grew louder. People noticed that Amber seemed increasingly tense, her smiles more brittle, her temper quicker to surface. A cousin told me in confidence that Amber had snapped at Blake in front of relatives, accusing him of undermining her. It was uncomfortable, my cousin admitted. Not what you expect from newlyweds. Part of me felt vindicated, seeing that others were beginning to glimpse the truth I had lived with. But another part of me felt only sorrow. I didn't want Amber's life to crumble. I wanted her to find peace, to build something solid and good. But how could she, when her foundation was built on deception and pride? I began to notice changes in myself too, small, subtle at first. I no longer walked with my head down when I passed neighbors, bracing for their judgment. Instead, I began to meet their eyes, even if my heart still trembled. I started attending community gatherings again, no longer hiding away out of shame. To my surprise, some people welcomed me warmly, as though they had been waiting for me to rejoin the world. Others remained distant, unsure, but I no longer let their hesitation define me. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun sink into the horizon, I realized that I had stopped waiting for Amber to call. The ache was still there, yes, but the expectation was gone. It was as though I had finally accepted that her silence was not a temporary punishment but a permanent choice. And in accepting that, I felt a strange kind of freedom. Still, life has a way of confronting us when we least expect it. At a family gathering for my nephew's birthday, Amber arrived with Blake, her presence commanding as always. She avoided me at first, circling the room like a queen surveying her court. But eventually, our paths crossed near the buffet table. Her eyes were sharp, her smile thin. "Mother," she said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "Amber," I replied, keeping my tone calm, neutral. Her gaze flickered over me, searching for weakness. "I hear you've been telling stories. People seem to think I've been cruel." I met her eyes steadily. "I haven't been telling stories. People see things for themselves." For a moment, something raw flashed across her face. Anger, fear, maybe both. But she quickly masked it with a laugh. "Well, people always love a scandal." She turned away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my plate half filled. Blake lingered nearby, his expression heavy. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I knew he had witnessed the exchange, had heard the edge in her voice. He gave me a small nod, so subtle it might have been mistaken for nothing at all, but I understood it as acknowledgement. He saw the truth even if he couldn't say it aloud. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the encounter, I realized something important. Amber no longer held the same power over me. Her words still hurt, yes, but they didn't control me. I didn't crumble under her gaze or scramble to appease her. I stood my ground, however, quietly. And in that moment of defiance, I felt the first true taste of strength I hadn't known I possessed. The months that followed were a strange mixture of tension and growth. Amber's reputation continued to falter as her manipulations became harder to hide. Blake grew more withdrawn, his once bright demeanor dimmed by the weight of her demands. Meanwhile, I found myself slowly stepping into a new version of life, one where I wasn't defined by my daughter's approval or rejection. But deep inside, a question lingered. How much of Amber's cruelty came from choices she had made, and how much was rooted in truths I hadn't yet uncovered? I didn't know then that answers were waiting for me, locked away in a safety deposit box, written in my father's hand. Answers that would change everything I thought I understood about Amber, about myself, and about the shadows of our past. The letter arrived in the most unassuming way, tucked between utility bills and a flyer for discounted tires. First, I almost missed it. The envelope was plain, my name written in careful script that tugged at something deep inside me. I hadn't seen my father's handwriting in years. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper that bore his unmistakable pen strokes. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone. But there are things you must know. Things I should have told you long ago, but cowardice, pride, and the weight of old mistakes kept me silent. I leave to you the key to my safety deposit box. Inside, you will find documents and records that will explain everything. Please, my child, forgive me for the secrets I carried. I sat frozen, the words blurring before my eyes. My father had been gone for nearly a decade. I had mourned him, honored him, even resented him for the cold distance he had often kept. But now he was speaking to me from beyond the grave, urging me to uncover truths he hadn't been brave enough to share in life. The following morning, with the letter folded neatly in my purse, I went to the bank. The clerk retrieved the box with practiced efficiency, sliding it across a polished counter. My fingers shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly organized files, photographs, and a leather-bound notebook. I lifted the notebook first, its cover worn, its pages yellowed at the edges. The first entry began decades ago, long before I was born. My father had written about a woman he loved deeply, a woman who was not my mother. As I turned the pages, the story unfolded in painful honesty. He had fallen in love with her during a time when his marriage was faltering. Their affair had lasted years, hidden behind closed doors, shrouded in lies, and then came the revelation that stole my breath. That woman was Amber's grandmother, not my mother. The bloodline I had assumed bound Amber and me together was not what I thought. My father had provided for them secretly, ensuring their security even as he built a second family in the shadows. Amber's father, the man she rarely spoke of, was not the distant, absent figure I had been led to believe. He was a product of my father's betrayal. The realization left me reeling. Amber was not just my daughter. She was the living reminder of secrets that had shaped generations. Her cruelty, her manipulations, her hunger for control, were these patterns echoes of wounds that had festered long before she was born? Or was it simply coincidence that the sins of one generation had rippled into the next? I turned to the documents in the box. Financial statements, property deeds, bank accounts, all carefully set aside for me. It became clear that my father, in his final years, had tried to make amends. He had built a portfolio meant to secure my future, a quiet attempt at atonement for the truths he had hidden. Yet even as I sifted through those papers, I felt no triumph. Instead, a hollow ache spread through me. Wealth could not rewrite the past. Money could not fill the chasm left by deception. Still, as I studied the numbers, I realized something startling. If Amber knew about this portfolio, and I suspected she did, her hostility toward me suddenly made sense. She wanted control of it. She wanted me erased not just from her life, but from the legal and financial structures my father had left. Her words at the wedding, her determination to banish me, they weren't only emotional cruelty. They were strategy. I left the bank that day with the box's contents locked securely in a new case, my mind a storm of grief and revelation. Walking down the street, I felt both fragile and strangely powerful. For so long, I had believed Amber's rejection was a reflection of my failures as a mother. But now I saw that it was rooted in something deeper, in a tangled web of family secrets and ambitions I had not created. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, spreading the documents across the surface. My father's notebook lay open, his words staring up at me like an unflinching witness. I wept tears of anger, sorrow, even relief. Anger at the lies that had shaped my life without my knowledge. Sorrow for the generations scarred by silence and betrayal. Relief that at last I understood. For hours I sat there, the house quiet around me until exhaustion forced me to bed. Yet even in sleep my dreams were haunted by images of my father, of Amber as a little girl, of shadows that stretched across decades and the days that followed. I noticed changes in myself. I no longer carried the same self-blame. I no longer replayed every moment of Amber's childhood wondering where I had gone wrong. Instead, I saw our relationship through a new lens, one that acknowledged my mistakes but also recognized the larger forces at play. When Amber next called, not to reconcile but to demand, I was ready. Her voice was sharp, edged with irritation. "I heard you've been looking through Dad's things," she said without preamble. "Those were supposed to come to me." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "They were left to me, Amber. Your grandfather made sure of that." Her silence crackled on the line, heavy with fury. "You don't deserve it," she finally spat. "You've done nothing but hold me back my entire life." I closed my eyes, letting her words wash over me without breaking me. "This isn't about deserving, Amber. This is about truth. And the truth is you can't erase me no matter how hard you try." There was a pause and then she laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "We'll see about that," she said before hanging up. I sat there holding the phone, my hand steady despite the tremor in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. She was afraid. She knew the ground beneath her was shifting. Blake showed up at my door a week later, unannounced. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, dark circles beneath his eyes. "She's unraveling," he admitted, his voice low. "Amber can't stop talking about you, about the money, about how unfair it all is. It's consuming her." I motioned for him to sit, pouring him a cup of tea as though he were still the polite young man I once hoped would bring peace into my daughter's life. "And what about you?" I asked gently. He rubbed his temples. "I don't know how much longer I can keep living like this." For the first time, I saw not just a son-in-law trapped in my daughter's orbit, but a man searching for escape, for truth. Part of me wanted to reach out, to reassure him that he wasn't alone. But another part of me knew he had to find his own strength. Just as I had that night after he left, I stood by the window and looked out at the darkened street. The weight of the portfolio, of my father's secrets, of Amber's rage, it all pressed against me. And yet, for the first time in years, I did not feel small beneath it. I felt solid. I felt like a woman who had endured storms and was still standing. Amber would come for me, I knew. She would twist, manipulate, threaten, do whatever she thought necessary to gain control. But I was no longer the mother she could dismiss with cruel words. I was no longer the woman who believed she deserved to disappear for her daughter's happiness. The truth was mine now, and with it came power. And though the battles ahead would be fierce, I no longer feared them. When the courier confirmed the portfolio had been delivered, I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the message for a long while. There was no rush of satisfaction, no triumphant sense of victory. Instead, there was a quiet heaviness, like the calm after a long storm where the ground is still sodden, the air still smells of rain, and you're not sure whether more clouds will gather. My final act as a mother had been completed. I had given Amber the truth, a truth she could neither dismiss nor reshape with her clever manipulations. Whether she embraced it or discarded it was her choice now, not mine. I wanted to believe there might be some flicker of recognition, some moment of reflection where she'd see the patterns for what they were. But a part of me knew Amber was more likely to double down, to lash out, to turn this truth into yet another weapon against me. The phone stayed silent for 2 days. I checked it more often than I wanted to admit, telling myself I was only doing so out of curiosity, not longing. On the third evening, a message appeared. It wasn't from Amber but from Blake. His words were cautious, careful, but they carried a tremor of something else, maybe gratitude, maybe fear. He thanked me for sending the information, said that Amber had been processing it, which was his diplomatic way of saying she had been spiraling. He didn't ask to meet, didn't offer updates, just wrote that he hoped I was well. I read the short message 6 times, searching between the lines for what he wasn't saying. Blake was caught in a storm of his own, tethered to Amber but beginning to glimpse the shoreline beyond her chaos. For the first time, I wondered whether he might one day step out from under her shadow. Not for me, not for reconciliation, but for himself. That night I dreamed of the wooden box left in the empty house. In the dream, Amber opened it herself, her face softening as she stared at the photograph of her younger self on my father's lap. I saw her fingertips brush the sealed envelope, hesitation flickering across her features before she opened it and read my 3 short lines. In the dream, tears welled in her eyes, her posture crumbling, and for the first time since childhood she whispered, "Mom." I woke up with wet cheeks, realizing I had been crying in my sleep, but reality offered no such tender moment. Reality was harsher, more complex. Amber did not call me. Instead, whispers began to filter back through the extended family, through old neighbors, through the invisible network of shared acquaintances that always seems to deliver news whether you want it or not. Amber was furious. Amber was telling people that I had tried to sabotage her marriage by dredging up fabricated dirt on her father. She claimed I was jealous of her life, that I couldn't stand her success, that I was inventing narratives to tear her down. Hearing these reports hurt less than I would have expected. Once, her lies would have devastated me, would have kept me awake night after night, wondering how to correct them, how to make people see the truth. But now I only felt a strange detachment. Let her spin her webs. Let her try to control the story. Those who had eyes to see would recognize the patterns. And those who didn't, well, they were not mine to convince anymore. It wasn't until a week later that Blake reached out again. This time he asked if I could meet him privately somewhere neutral. He suggested a quiet cafe just off the interstate, halfway between his parents' guest house and my new town. I hesitated, fearing that it might be some sort of trap orchestrated by Amber, a confrontation waiting to happen. But something in his message, perhaps the weary tone, convinced me to go. When I arrived, Blake was already there, sitting with a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked older than I remembered, lines etched into his forehead, the beginnings of gray at his temples. For a moment I saw the weight he carried, not just of his marriage but of all the lies he had been forced to live inside. He stood when I approached, offering an awkward but genuine smile. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. We sat, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly together. "Amber is not handling this well," he admitted. "She says you're trying to poison her against her father. She says you've always wanted to undermine her." He paused, searching my eyes. "But I read through everything you sent. I saw the documents. I know it's real. I don't know what to do with it, but I know you didn't invent it." Relief flickered through me, not because I needed his validation but because someone finally was acknowledging the truth aloud. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. He went on. "She's angry at me for not siding with her completely. She wants me to denounce you, to tell everyone that you're delusional. I can't do that. I won't do that." For the first time in years, I reached across the table and laid my hand over his clenched fists. "You don't have to protect me, Blake," I said softly. "You just have to protect yourself. And if you can, protect the man you still want to be." His eyes filled with something raw, something fragile. Gratitude, perhaps. Or despair. He didn't hold my hand, but he didn't pull away either. When we parted, I felt a strange peace. Blake's path was his own, just as Amber's was hers. My responsibility was no longer to fix, to explain, to heal. My responsibility was only to myself. Amber, however, was not done. Within days, legal papers arrived. An attempt to claim that the funds from my father's trust had been mismanaged, that I had somehow deprived her of what was rightfully hers. The accusation was absurd. Every dollar had gone into her education, into supporting her ambitions, into smoothing the road she had so eagerly traveled. But absurdity had never stopped Amber before. I handed the papers to Jonathan, who assured me calmly that her claims held no merit. "This is a scare tactic," he said. "Nothing more. She's lashing out because she can't control the narrative anymore." Even so, seeing her threats in black and white brought back a familiar pang of maternal grief. How had my daughter become this person? So quick to destroy, so incapable of reflection. Yet beneath the grief was a steel I hadn't known I possessed. I would not yield. Not this time. Weeks passed. The case went nowhere, dismissed before it ever gained traction. I received another message from Blake, this one briefer, more resigned. "She's furious. I don't know how much longer I can keep living like this." I didn't reply. There was nothing I could offer him but the quiet knowledge that freedom was possible, that strength could be found on the other side of breaking away. He would have to discover that himself, just as I had. And so I returned to my life by the water, to the simple rhythms of mornings on the dock and evenings watching the sky blaze with color. Each day I felt more present, more whole. The wounds were still there, of course, they always would be, but they no longer defined me. One afternoon, months after our cafe meeting, I received a small envelope in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hesitant. Inside was a short note from Blake. He didn't say much, only that he had moved out, that he was starting over, and that he wanted to thank me, not for anything specific but for showing him that leaving was possible. There was no mention of Amber. No promises, no requests. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a man stepping into his own truth at last. I held the note for a long time, feeling a complicated swirl of emotions. Sadness for the wreckage Amber left in her wake. Hope that Blake might find peace. And above all, a profound sense of release. Their choices no longer bound me. The final time I heard Amber's name came not through her, but through an old family acquaintance. She had moved to another city, still practicing law, still spinning her stories, still trying to command the world with her sharp smile and sharper words. Whether she ever opened the portfolio fully, whether she ever visited the house and found the wooden box with the photograph and the note, I cannot say. Perhaps she dismissed them. Perhaps she tucked them away in a drawer, waiting for a day when she might be ready to face herself. Or perhaps she burned them in anger. Whatever she chose, it was her choice. That was the hardest lesson of motherhood, the realization that no matter how much love, effort, or sacrifice you pour into a child, in the end their life is their own, their choice is their own, their truths theirs alone to accept or deny. As for me, I began to live. Not for Amber, not for the shadow of David, not even for the memory of my father's protective love, but for myself. I painted again, filling canvases with the colors of the sunsets I had watched in silence for too many years. I joined a small book club in town, my voice tentative at first, then growing stronger as I realized these women valued my thoughts, my laughter, my presence. I hosted neighbors on my porch, serving iced tea and listening to their stories, stories free of manipulation and hidden barbs. Slowly, I rebuilt something I hadn't realized I'd lost. A sense of belonging not tied to obligation or sacrifice, but to authenticity. Sometimes, when the evening is particularly still, I take out a photograph of Amber as a child, the same one I placed in the wooden box. I look at her bright eyes, her mischievous smile, the innocence that hadn't yet hardened into cruelty, and I whisper a silent prayer that somewhere beneath all the layers of anger and entitlement, that child still exists, waiting to be found. Whether Amber ever chooses to seek her or not, I may never know. But the prayer is not for her alone. It is for me too, for the parts of myself I have rediscovered, for the strength I never knew I possessed, for the peace I have finally claimed. They once called me the worst mother anyone could have. Perhaps in Amber's eyes I always will be. But I know the truth now. The worst mother would have been one who allowed the cruelty to continue unchecked, who sacrificed her own soul endlessly on the altar of a daughter's demands. The worst mother would have been one who confused enabling with love. I was not that mother. I was the mother who endured, who hoped, who finally chose to let go. And in that letting go, I found not only my own freedom, but a new definition of love, one rooted not in control or sacrifice, but in truth and boundaries and the quiet courage to walk away. That, I have learned, is not the worst gift a mother can give. It is perhaps the best.